Okay, so this is another example, and the thing to note is that a couple of these questions, which are qualitative questions, will populate different questions for different students. The essence of the question is the same, so the principle that I am going to be speaking to will be applicable to all the questions. And if it's not, you absolutely can go ahead and click on textbook and flip through to find the reference that's going to help with that. Now, these questions are all talking about p-value, and one of the things that you need to note in this case, it's saying if the p-value is 0.01, we reject the null hypothesis for any alpha greater than 0.01. You're being asked if that is true, and if it's not, you're being asked to say why. The thing to remember is on page 305, you will see the conclusion. If the p-value is low, then you reject the null hypothesis and conclude that the alternative hypothesis is correct. If the p-value is not low enough, then we fail to reject the null hypothesis, and the test becomes inconclusive. Now, a couple of things. There are two types of errors the chapter speaks about. It speaks about a type 1 error, which is if the null hypothesis is correct, but there's a mistake and the null hypothesis is rejected, then that's a type 1 error. And that will happen for you to reject the null hypothesis. It would have meant that you have a low p. So a low p that leads to an incorrectly rejected null hypothesis results in a type 1 error. The other possible error is the null hypothesis is false, but it is not rejected, and that is a type 2 error. Now, important to note that a lower alpha level lowers the probability of a type 1 error, but increases the probability of a type 2 error. So if you lower the value of alpha, you have a lower chance of mistakenly rejecting a true null hypothesis, but it increases your chances of not rejecting a false hypothesis. So it requires a little bit of thinking through this. So you absolutely have to be careful that you are doing that. Let's just look at this statement here. Now, the p-value is the probability of observing a value from a test statistic at least as far from the hypothesized value as the statistic value actually observed if the null hypothesis is true. So what they're saying essentially is, let's assume that the null hypothesis is true. The p-value that you are getting is telling you the probability of that value, the probability of the values you have being correct. And what we're saying, if alpha level is a threshold for the p-value that determines when we reject a null hypothesis. So if that probability is too low, then we are saying the data we have is not supporting the result. So we are going to reject the null hypothesis. So it takes a little concentrating to get it. But once you figure out that a low p-value results in a rejection of the null hypothesis, you will sort of be able to wrap your head around it. Alright? And we went into the different types of errors that can occur. The type 1 error is if the null hypothesis is true but it is mistakenly rejected. And the type 2 is if the null hypothesis is false but it is not rejected. And if you think about this, there are only two possibilities of errors. The null hypothesis can either be true and it is not rejected, or it is mistakenly rejected, or the null hypothesis is false and it is not rejected. The other two possibilities would not include any type of error whatsoever. So that's some little tips that should help you with these questions. And these are detailed on page 317. So what we're saying is that in these two cases, the null hypothesis is false and it was rejected. That's okay. Null hypothesis is true and it's accepted, and we fail to reject it, which means no error was made. The errors are made in this situation where the null hypothesis is true but it's rejected. We didn't realize that the null hypothesis was true, so we said the alternative hypothesis is what we are concluding is correct from the experiment. So that's a type 1 error. And the type 2 error occurs if the null hypothesis is false and the experimentation and data gathered fails to reject the null hypothesis. Alright, so read through the chapter, be sure to reach out and ask questions. Read through the questions and read through the multiple parts before you give a response, because sometimes they can be a little tricky. So please feel free to ask for help if you need it. Alright, thank you. Bye.